Did you know there's a hierarchy inside Japanese watchmaking that most people misread completely? They assume that because these brands share a country, they share a standard. They don't. The gap between the worst and the best Japanese build quality is wider than the gap between a Swiss budget watch and a Rolex. This is the honest ranking. Let's go. Number 1, Creator. Most of you have never heard this name. Good. That's part of what makes it the answer. Creator doesn't advertise. It doesn't do press events, social media campaigns, or boutique openings in any international market. It produces roughly 20 watches per year from a single specialized room inside Seiko's micro-artist studio and sells them exclusively in Japan, starting at around $53,000. There are no gray market listings because the collectors who buy Creator watches aren't selling them. The flagship is the Aiki 2. Platinum or rose gold case, Zaratsu polished to a mirror edge with no distortion anywhere on the surface. When you hold one under direct light and tilt it slowly, the reflection stays sharp at every angle. No waviness, no buffer marks, no approximation of a mirror, but an actual mirror. Most Swiss manufacturers at this price point, and there are several with legitimate claims to world-class finishing, don't achieve this consistently. Creator achieves it on every piece that ships. And then there's the dial. Hand-painted porcelain. Not a photographic print, not a digital transfer. A single artisan applies enamel with brushes made from cat hair over multiple firings, and the reject rate is substantial. Most dials made for the Aichi 2 don't survive the process. The ones that do carry a depth that photographs cannot capture. You have to hold one about 6 inches from your face, tilt it slowly, and watch the surface change as the angle of light shifts. It doesn't look like a watch dial. It looks like you're looking through something. The movement is the spring drive caliber 7R14. Spring drive has no equivalent in watchmaking. It uses a mainspring for power, fully mechanical, wound by hand or rotor, no battery. But the escapement is replaced by an electromagnetic brake called the tri-synchro regulator, governed by a quartz crystal oscillator. The result is a seconds hand that glides rather than ticks. Continuous motion, true continuous motion. And the 7R14 achieves plus or minus 15 seconds per month, which is extraordinary for a mainspring-driven watch. Creator didn't stop at the movement design, though. The brand consulted Philippe Dufour on the movement finishing. If you know watchmaking, you know what that name means. Dufour is a Swiss independent whose work represents the ceiling of human finishing capability. He reviewed Creator's work, identified what still needed attention, and the brand changed it. The fact that Seiko sought external critique from Geneva says something. So does the fact that Dufour agreed to provide it. 20 pieces a year. That isn't a capacity limitation. It's the ceiling set by what the standard actually costs to maintain. Raise the count and you have to cut somewhere. Creator doesn't cut. The collector who buys an Aichi 2 isn't buying a status symbol in the conventional sense. They're buying the clearest available evidence that Japanese watchmaking can produce something indistinguishable from the finest work coming out of Geneva or Le Brassus. Most of them keep it in a velvet-lined drawer. They take it out twice a year. They are completely right. Here's the observation that took me a long time to fully articulate. The micro-artist studio exists inside Seiko Group, but operates on entirely different logic from the rest of the organization. Seiko is a high-volume manufacturer. Grand Seiko is a luxury manufacturer. Creator is neither. It's a proof of concept that was never designed to be profitable. The company is asking itself, if we remove every commercial constraint, what can we actually produce? The Aichi 2 is the answer. 20 pieces a year at $53,000 starting price doesn't generate meaningful revenue for a corporation of Seiko's scale. It generates something harder to quantify. Proof that the ceiling of Japanese watchmaking sits above Switzerland's finest, when volume stops being a factor. Most Swiss manufacturers don't have an equivalent. They don't have a room where the brief is make the best thing possible regardless of cost. Creator is that room, and the Aichi 2 is what comes out of it. Creator is what Japan produces when cost becomes irrelevant. What's next is what Japan does when excellence still has commercial constraints and how close it gets anyway. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. That's why I created a complete insider guide to buying watches. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. Number 2, Grand Seiko. In early 2025, Grand Seiko released the Spring Drive UFA. The stated accuracy is plus or minus 20 seconds per year. To give that number scale, the most precise conventional mechanical watches run to roughly 2 seconds per day, which translates to about 12 minutes of drift per year. Grand Seiko's UFA allows 20 seconds across the same period. You'd need to wear the finest Swiss mechanical for 3 years to accumulate the error this movement allows in 12 months. That's not marketing language. That's a stated specification from a caliber that launched publicly alongside the Evolution 9 series. But the movement accuracy is, in a strange way, the least impressive part. The most impressive part is the case finishing. The Zaratsu polishing technique was developed at Grand Seiko's Shizukuishi Watch Studio in Iwate Prefecture. It's applied by hand to steel or titanium surfaces, and it produces flat planes that reflect without any distortion. Take the Snowflake, the titanium dress watch with the dial inspired by frost on birch bark near the Shinshu Watch Studio in Nagano. Tilt the case under a strong light. The flat surfaces act as actual mirrors. Not approximate mirrors, real ones. Swiss competitors at the same $4,000 to $8,000 price tier achieve something similar on their best models, with effort at cost. Grand Seiko treats it as a production standard. Then there are the dials. Grand Seiko draws its visual language from the landscapes directly surrounding its 2 main studios. Snowfall. The texture of frozen lake surfaces. The quiet gradients of forests shifting between seasons. A dial called Omiwatari, named after the crack that forms on a frozen lake near the Shinshu studio each January, retails around $5,000 and sells on release. The texture is created through a mechanical process the brand hasn't publicly documented. The result is a surface that reads entirely differently under changing light. Photographs of Grand Seiko dials are inadequate in a way that photographs of most other watches are not. Something needs to be said about quality control, because honesty matters more than brand protection here. Watch You Seek Threads from 2019 documented a hair trapped under the crystal of a GMT model. Separate forum members have noted misaligned hands-on pieces over $5,000. These aren't widespread problems, but at this finishing tier and this price, even occasional slippage is worth noting. The brand has grown fast since becoming a standalone entity in 2017, and that growth puts pressure on inspection consistency. Grand Seiko acknowledged this, at least obliquely, by improving their bracelet clasp quality in 2025 through a new 3-step micro-adjustment system that closes a gap collectors had pointed out for years. Tool-free adjustment in 2mm increments, up to 6 total. They listened. The product changed. That matters. None of that changes Grand Seiko's position in this ranking. It's one of the 5 finest watch manufacturers on Earth by any serious assessment. But it explains why Crador sits above it. At 20 pieces annually, every defect can be caught before it ships. At Grand Seiko's scale, the math becomes harder. Here's the observation that took me a while to articulate. Grand Seiko and Crador exist in the same corporate family under Seiko Group, and they achieve completely different results. Same parent company, same founding engineering culture, same Zaratsu polishing heritage. But Crador achieves finishing that Grand Seiko, at scale, cannot replicate consistently. The constraint isn't knowledge, it's volume. And that's actually the most interesting thing about the Japanese system at the top end. They understand that quality has a production ceiling, and they built Crador specifically to operate above it, outside of any commercial production target. That's not an accident. It's a structural decision. Crador exists because the people inside Seiko Group wanted proof of what they could actually do if they removed the volume mandate entirely. The Aiki 2 is that proof. Grand Seiko builds at the edge of what a brand can sustain at scale. The man coming next ignores the concept of scale entirely, and what he produces shows. Number 3. Hajime Asaoka. There's a workshop in Bunkyoku, Tokyo, where one person builds watches from scratch. Hajime Asaoka graduated from Tokyo University of Arts in design. In 2005, he was commissioned to design a watch. The experience absorbed him completely, and he decided to teach himself mechanical watchmaking. He read George Daniel's Watchmaking, the text used to train Swiss masters at the highest levels. He made his own tools. He machined his own components. In 2009, he produced the first entirely Japan-made tourbillon wristwatch, not the first Japanese tourbillon. Every single component, the bridges, the wheels, the escapement, the regulator, the case, made in Japan by a Japanese watchmaker alone. He formally launched his brand in 2011. The signature piece is the Tsunami. Its defining feature is the balance wheel, 16 millimeters in diameter. A standard mechanical watch uses a balance between 6 and 9 millimeters. Asaoka's is enormous, titanium. When it oscillates, the visual weight is something that photographs don't prepare you for. Look through the display caseback and the balance wheel fills most of the frame. It moves with a slow, deliberate arc that makes every other movement look slightly rushed. Beyond the Tsunami, Asaoka has produced 2 separate tourbillon designs and a chronograph, all entirely handmade in his workshop. Annual production runs to single digits. Prices start above $100,000. There's no reliable delivery schedule because there's no production line. He builds when he builds. Here's where I have to be transparent about something. By pure technical craft, the argument for Asaoka at number 1 is not frivolous. Crador has Dufour's input on finishing. Asaoka has no committee, no consultant, no shared infrastructure from a parent corporation. Everything he produces was made by his hands. The counter-argument for ranking Crador first is institutional. Crador replicates the same result 20 times per year through documented processes. Asaoka produces single objects that cannot be reproduced. Comparing them is partially a philosophical question about what we mean by build quality. The consistent replication of a defined standard, or the ceiling of what a single human being can achieve without assistance? Honestly, I'm not fully settled on this one. I've gone back and forth since I started thinking about this ranking. The argument for Asaoka first rests on a real observation. Institutional watchmaking, even at Crador's level, has processes. Templates, inherited techniques. What Asaoka does is different in kind, not just degree. He has no inherited technique to fall back on. Every solution to every problem in a Tsunami is one he worked out himself. The balance wheel size alone required him to redesign the geometry of the entire movement to accommodate it. That's not refinement of an existing standard. That's building from scratch. I kept Asaoka at 3 because the ranking is about build quality as a reproducible standard, not about the ceiling of one person's craft. But if you think that framing is wrong, say so in the comments. I want to hear it. What one man builds alone, Seiko tries to build at volume. That tension is exactly where things get complicated and interesting. Number 4, Seiko, Presage and Prospect's top tier. Seiko is the most contradictory brand in watchmaking. Not just in Japan, anywhere. At its peak, Seiko produces things that have no business existing at the prices they ask. The Presage Sharp-Edged series, specifically the SPB models using the 6R55 caliber, delivers Zaratsu polishing on stainless steel cases for around $600. Grand Seiko applies the same polishing technique at $3,000 as a production standard. Seiko brings it to the $600 tier on a watch that, held under direct light, produces flatly embarrassing results for Swiss competitors at twice the price. The 6R35 movement inside the mid-tier Presage and top Prospects models runs 70 hours of power reserve. That's generous for the price tier. It hacks, it hand wins, and it leaves the factory regulated to -10 to +15 seconds per day. Forum members who've regulated their own examples consistently report tighter performance. The magic lever winding system, Seiko's proprietary bidirectional rotor mechanism, has been refined across 5 decades and doesn't exhibit the wear patterns that some Swiss entry movements develop at comparable prices. The system oscillates in both directions, which means the mainspring winds more efficiently during natural wrist movement than a unidirectional rotor does. It's a small detail that accumulates into real-world running consistency. There's also the NH35. It's the movement that powers approximately a quarter of the world's affordable automatic watches, once you count the third-party micro-brands that license it, and it's been in continuous production in essentially the same form since its predecessors in the 70s. Parts for an NH35 are cheaper and more available than parts for virtually any other automatic movement. A replacement rotor, a mainspring, or a complete movement on the secondary market costs less than $30. The result is a watch ecosystem where even modest Seiko automatics have realistic service lifespans measured in decades. That's not glamorous, but it's a kind of build quality that expensive Swiss movements often can't match for practical ownership. Think about the person who bought a Seiko Marine Master, 300 inches, 2015, for $650. High beat 8L, 35 movement. Case finishing that outperformed Omega's comparable offering at double the money. He's still wearing it, no service yet. He's looked at Tudor Pelagos listings twice and put his phone down both times. So why is Seiko fourth? Because below the Presage and upper Prospects tier, the brand carries a quality control problem it hasn't resolved. A well-known UK online retailer added a disclaimer to their Seiko product listings, explaining that bezel and chapter ring tolerance ranges were wider than the retailer's own standard, not to deter buyers. To manage the return calls, that disclaimer is a document. It says that at a brand of Seiko's manufacturing depth, with its stated engineering culture, with Grand Seiko in the same corporate family, the acceptable standards at the budget tier are loose enough that a professional reseller felt the need to warn customers in advance. Walk into a Seiko stockist and run your thumb along 4 turtle bezels sitting on the display. On a good day, all 4 feel crisp. On a less good day, one clicks differently from the others, or it starts its rotation half a click off 12, not broken, within spec. But the spec is generous enough that the consumer is absorbing the tolerance, not the factory. Most budget Seikos are fine. But most are fine is a low bar for a brand that makes the Presage enamel dial series, which puts urushi lacquer on a production watch for $500 using techniques borrowed from Japanese fine art. That standard and the misaligned bezel is within spec standard are both Seiko. They're wearing the same name. The gap between them is wider than the brand seems willing to close. That split is the reason Seiko sits at 4. Seiko carries its contradictions forward. Citizen made a simpler bet. Be world-class at one specific thing and never blink. Number 5. Citizen, Atessa, and the Citizen line. Set aside movement decoration and case finishing for a moment, because Citizen is making a different argument. The Eco Drive system, patented by Citizen and refined continuously since 1976, converts any light source into stored electrical charge. Sunlight, fluorescent office lighting, the glow from a bedside lamp. A fully charged Eco Drive runs 6 months in complete darkness. On forum member documented leaving a Citizen in a drawer, forgetting about it entirely, and finding it still running 4 months later. That's not a boast. That's a report from an owner who forgot about his watch and was mildly surprised it hadn't died. For a mechanical watch person, that's either impressive or faintly unnerving, depending on your relationship with the ritual of winding. The Atessa line adds GPS satellite synchronization and atomic radio timekeeping. The resulting accuracy falls within fractions of a second per year. No mechanical watch achieves that. Not Grand Seiko's UFA. Not anything wound by a spring. The Atessa CC9-05557E, which sits around the $1,000 mark, synchronizes its time via GPS satellite on the wrist and shows the correct time zone automatically when you step off a plane. The movement never drifts enough for the wearer to notice. That's a different kind of precision than Spring Drive offers, but it's not a lesser kind. Super Titanium is Citizen's material engineering bet. Their proprietary titanium alloy, treated through a surface hardening process called Duratect, achieves 5 times the surface hardness of standard stainless steel, scratch resistance that steel cannot match. Wrist weight roughly 40% lower than an equivalent steel case. On a day where you're wearing a watch for 12 hours, that weight difference becomes noticeable in the best possible way. It also solves nickel sensitivity, which affects a non-trivial percentage of wearers who have never connected their skin reactions to metal composition. The industry doesn't love to talk about this, but Citizen's material choice quietly addresses it. At the Citizen line tier, the brand's premium collection priced up to around $3,000, movements achieve plus or minus 5 seconds per year. The Exceed Eco Drive 2.908 millimeters is the thinnest solar watch ever made. These are real engineering achievements, not marketing language. But here's the honest gap. Exhibition casebacks on Citizen watches reveal clean, precise engineering with no decorative ambition. Bridges aren't chamfered to a mirror finish. Movement surfaces aren't polished beyond functional requirements. Compared to a Seiko Presage caseback at a comparable price, the Citizen movement interior looks purposeful and aesthetically austere. That's a deliberate design choice, not a failure. But in a ranking specifically about build quality in the watchmaking sense, finishing and movement craft are components of that quality, and the gap is real. The collector community reflects this divide. Citizen builds users, loyal, practical users who trust their watches the way they trust a well-maintained car, completely, without needing to think about it. The watch community tends to move towards Seiko's mechanical depth. That's not Citizen's problem to solve. It just defines where the brand sits in this specific conversation. Citizen chose technology over craft. What comes next chose something harder. Maximum craft, accessible price, and a famous name overseeing every piece. Number 6. Kurono Tokyo. Drops happen without warning. A model appears on the website. Within 4 minutes, sometimes under 90 seconds, it's sold out. The same pieces show up on Chrono 2.4 the following morning at 2 to 3 times retail. Kurono Tokyo launched in 2019. Hajime Asaoka, who builds the $100,000 Tsunami by hand in his Tokyo workshop, designed this line specifically so he could wear his own watches daily without risking something irreplaceable. The watches are assembled in his Bunkyo-ku studio. He reviews every piece before it ships. The price range runs roughly $2,000 to $4,000, depending on the model. The movements inside are third-party, Seiko NH35 or Miyota 9015, depending on configuration. The 9015 runs at 28,800 vibrations per hour, which produces a visibly smoother seconds hand sweep than the NH35's 21,600. Both are reliable and serviceable, neither is in-house. At this price point, most established watch brands offer proprietary calibers, and that gap is worth naming honestly. The dials are why the resellers take the risk. Urushi lacquer is extracted from tree sap in minute quantities, applied in thin layers, with each coat requiring days of controlled drying before the next can follow. The production fail rate is high. Dials that develop bubbles, uneven edges, or inconsistent depth are discarded. The Grand Urushi Aoyama edition used hand-applied mocha lacquer, polished few hands, and hand-applied kanji numerals. The dial depth reads like Grand Few enamel, the technique Swiss houses charge 10 times the price to deliver. The connection is structural. Both are traditional artisan surface processes with high failure rates and irreproducible visual depth. Kurono at $3,000 is a specific transaction. You're purchasing Asaoka's design language, his quality oversight, and the Urushi process. You're accepting third-party mechanics. Collectors who understand that tend to be extremely satisfied. Collectors who assume in-house movements come with the territory tend to be surprised when they look up the caliber. The bracelet and case finishing on Kurono pieces are better than the movement question might suggest. Cases are fully polished, sized for wearability in a range of 34 to 38 millimeters, and assembled with a consistency that reflects Asaoka's personal involvement. These are not micro brands with outsourced assembly. They're watches that a master watchmaker personally approved for shipment. Kurono brings the artisan's eye within reach. Orient is doing something more stubborn, fully in-house mechanics at a price that shouldn't include them. Number 7. Orient. Orient builds every watch with an in-house movement, every single one, including the Bambino at $120. That deserves a pause. At a price tier where every competitor, including Seiko's own entry lines, uses purchased or licensed calibers, Orient designs, manufactures, and assembles their own. The F6922 inside the base Bambino has been refined across multiple generations. It hacks, hand wins, delivers roughly 40 hours of power reserve, and oscillates at. It's not a dressed-up movement. No decorated rotor, no chamfered bridges visible through a display back, but it's Orient's, and that commitment means something when you're looking at long-term serviceability and reliability data. Orient Star steps up to the F8N55, which adds a proprietary power reserve indicator. A power reserve complication on a watch under $500 requires its own wheel train and indicator mechanism. It's a real complication at a price most brands don't consider serious complication territory. The casework is clean and consistent, not aspirational, but tight. In experience, comparing examples side by side, a Bambino at $150 carries tolerances that outperform many Seiko budget pieces at the same price. Some of that is a volume function. Orient makes far fewer watches than Seiko, and inspection is easier at lower throughput. But some of it reflects what happens when you put your own movement inside a case. You care about every component that surrounds it differently than a brand that bought the movement from a supplier and assembled around it. There's a forum member on Watch You Seek who's been wearing an Orient Mako daily since 2008. He posted about it in 2024. Hasn't serviced it, it still runs within spec. He's looked at Seiko SKX successors several times and keeps deciding the Mako isn't broken enough to replace. 16 years of daily wear on a watch that cost him roughly $180. That's not luck. That's the long-run output of sound engineering and honest production standards applied consistently to a movement the brand actually controls. Multiple independent Watch You Seek members have documented similar experiences across different models. Not isolated cases. A pattern. Conservative movement design executed correctly outlasts ambitious engineering executed adequately, every time. Where Orient falls short is surface finish ambition. Most models use Hardlex mineral crystal rather than sapphire. Case surfaces are machine finished without the hand polishing that distinguishes the tier above. A Bambino is beautiful in a composed, understated way. It doesn't announce itself. For a brand this mechanically committed at this price point, the presentation on the outside undersells what's happening inside. But that's a specific limitation in a specific dimension. On movement engineering quality, production consistency, and the long-term performance data from actual owners, Orient's position here is earned. Orient builds with quiet conviction. What finishes last builds with a completely different kind of conviction, and within its own category, nothing on this list can touch it. Number 8. Casio, G-Shock, and Oceanus. Last. And this requires some precision about what that actually means. Casio finishes at the bottom of this ranking under the specific criteria of traditional horological build quality. Case finishing, movement decoration, bracelet engineering, dial craft. In those dimensions, Casio doesn't compete with the names above it, and it has never tried. What Casio built instead is something none of the other brands on this list can replicate. A shock resistance engineering program that took 3 years and 200 prototype iterations before a passing design emerged. Kikuo Ibe, the engineer behind G-Shock, spent those years dropping prototypes off the roof of Casio's Hamura factory in Tokyo. Most shattered or malfunctioned on contact. The DW5000 that passed all testing in 1983 survived 10-meter drops onto concrete, immersion to 10 ATM, and temperature extremes from -20 to 60 degrees Celsius. It retailed for roughly $50. The engineering logic behind that success is worth understanding. A G-Shock doesn't resist impact the way metal resists impact. Metal dents and transfers force to the movement inside. A G-Shock's resin case flexes on impact and dissipates the energy before it reaches the module. The crystal sits recessed inside the case, protected by the bezel rather than flush with the surface. The winding crown is recessed and guarded. The movement itself is suspended inside the case on a separate inner module, mounted on rubber, not touching the outer case directly. This is a completely different approach to protection than any Swiss military watch uses, and by every measurable standard of drop and shock survival, it works better. 40+ years later, the GW5000HS1 uses a full stainless steel outer case with a carbon fiber inner guard, tungsten ion plating on the case back, and atomic timekeeping via shortwave radio from 6 global transmitters. When in signal range, it synchronizes to within milliseconds of atomic time. When not, it runs at quartz drift rates that outperform every mechanical watch on this list. And here's what I keep coming back to. G-Shock accounts on Watch You Seek and Reddit are remarkably consistent in one category: Not how nice the watch looks, how long it lasts with zero intervention. The DW 5600 series has accounts of 5 and 10 years of daily outdoor use with no service, no failure, no winding, because it doesn't need it. These aren't exceptional cases on the forum. They're routine. The community is no longer impressed by them because they've become expected. The Oceanus sits above G-Shock in material ambition. Sapphire crystal, titanium cases, GPS synchronization. But Oceanus hasn't developed the movement finishing philosophy that places Citizen's Attessa tier in a separate category. And in the price range where Oceanus competes, that gap is visible to someone who's spent time with the alternatives. But here's the honest close on Casio. A watch that doesn't require service, doesn't require winding, synchronizes itself to atomic time, and survives conditions that would destroy every other watch on this list, has a specific kind of build quality. It's not the kind that horological tradition has developed over 300 years of Swiss and Japanese fine watchmaking. But it's real, it's measurable, and it's dependable in ways the other brands on this list aren't built to be. Last doesn't mean bad. It just means this is the wrong measuring stick for what Casio decided to care about. 8 brands, 1 country. The full range of what Japanese manufacturing can produce when it commits to a standard completely. Something connects every brand on this list that isn't obvious until you look at them together, none of them hedged. Credor didn't say, we'll make 20 pieces a year, but we'll also do a budget line to fund it. Casio didn't say, we'll make rugged watches, but we'll also do beautiful finishing on the upper tier. Orient didn't say, we'll do in-house movements on the premium models and buy calibers for the entry pieces. Each brand picked a direction and stayed there. The Japanese call that monozukuri, the art of making things, not the art of selling things, not the art of managing investor expectations, not the art of hedging against market shifts, making the thing correctly. All the way, every time. You can argue with this ranking. You should. If you think Citizen deserves to be above Seiko, make the case. The technology argument is real, and I don't dismiss it lightly. If you think Hajime Asauka should sit above Grand Seiko, I already told you I thought about that more than any other placement on this list. If you think Casio should be higher because build quality should include shock survival as a category, I'm listening. That's a legitimate counter. Drop your placement in the comments. Which brand do you think I ranked wrong, and why? The best arguments will shape the follow-up video. One more thing. If you're wearing a Grand Seiko, an Orient, or a G-Shock right now, and this video changed how you think about what's on your wrist, that's the whole point. Every video here is built the same way. Research first, opinion after, and the evidence leads wherever it leads. Subscribe if you want more of that.